oh, look, Shinzen talks about zooming in and zooming out, but Chuladasa talks about attention and awareness. So which one is right?
Who's the true guru? I wanted to talk to Shinzen because I'm starting a course on the path of awakening. Shinzen was raised Jewish in a Catholic part of LA, but decided to dedicate himself to Buddhist study. He wanted to immerse himself in the experiential side of Buddhism, so he ditched his PhD and went to Japan to become a monk. He's a rare combination of a meditation master who is willing to talk about awakening openly. In this conversation, we talk about how these different maps align, how do we know who to listen to on this path, and how do we create a skeleton key to any of the paths of awakening. Welcome to part 1 of my conversation with Shinzen Young. How are you?
I'm fantastic.
Good. I'm very glad to hear that. Thank you so much for taking a little bit of time just to chit-chat like kitty cats. So a little bit of context for anyone who might be seeing this. You know that I'm starting a new unit of this class, the Progress of Shinsight, which is exploring one of the traditional maps of classical awakening in relationship to your system and how you tend to view material without placing any judgment, which one is, one being better than the other. But from my perspective, I really like your view of the of all of meditation material. So relaying that and overlaying that on top of some of these traditional maps.
Yes, can I ask a question?
Please.
Against which map are you exploring a relationship with the Unified Mindfulness system?
Well, it's the Progress of Insight map, hence the name Progress of Shinsight.
Here's what I think you mean by the Progress of Insight.
Mm-hmm.
I think you mean some English translations of some of the important materials that were either in Burmese or Pali, probably yes, the former more, but I'm not sure, used by the people that were trained by Mahasi Sayadaw.
Exactly, and it's based on that title written by Mahasi, translation of his instructions, mainly actually for teachers, that either towards the end of his life or after his life, there was a decision made to make this publicly available for anyone who wanted it, for the same reasons you're describing, that this was originally meant as something, as a guide, so teachers could assess where students potentially were. But it is exactly that. It's a commentary on the Visuddhimagga, which is a commentary on the Pali Canon, which all of this became popular with a commentary written in whatever 2000, etc., by our friend Daniel, who that's sort of become interesting or become in the popular mind. And something that I found very interesting is bringing in the sort of panoramic view of some of this material from the perspective of your system, and also having a much heavier emphasis than I've typically seen on experiencing the material rather than understanding it first and then trying to fit our experience into a
yeah, that's right. So this is very interesting. Just to give the broader context, Daniel, who you mentioned, is our friend Daniel Ingram, who shares a connection with me in terms of lineage, in the sense that we're connected through his teacher, and William Hamilton, that's right, through Bill. Bill and I were sort of co-teachers to each other and very good friends back in the day. William Hamilton is one of the great unsung heroes of the modern mindfulness movement. He died young of cancer, so didn't really have a chance to become as known as would have warranted, but huge influence on me. Basically, he funneled that material to me because he'd gotten his hands on it way, way back, because he was very close to Upandita, who sort of became the main guy from Mahasi. So, but because Bill Hamilton had experience, and because he was also essentially a scientist, he was an audio engineer, and he's the one that made all the inexpensive mindfulness teachers tapes available when tapes were the way people stored information. So in any event, Kenneth Folk is also shares that connection. So we all have something in common, and it's interesting because it's feeding back. Bill Hamilton gave me the inside story, as was his understanding from the inside guy, way before this stuff, as far as I know, was available to anyone. And that did convince me of the power of the Mahasi innovation, which is the noting way of working. Daniel is a response to Mahasi, or the Mahasi inner circle. Mahasi is a response to Buddhaghosa. Buddhaghosa is a response to early Theravada. Early Theravada is the best record that we have, albeit centuries later, of early Buddhism. Early Buddhism is presumably closely connected with what the Buddha himself taught. But you see its layer, its response, each one of those layers is a response to a response. The Buddha was a response to the Hindu orthodoxy on one side, but his own Shramana movement on the other. So, and those were a response to the Vedas. So you have a response to a response to a response to a response. Whoa, we're way up on the food chain here. And it's a good news, bad news. Good news, hopefully things improve. Bad news, really easy for breakdown in communication.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's something that you have talked about before, and this is sort of a broader question, but how can we trust any of these people? How can we trust Buddhaghosa or Mahasi or Daniel or yourself? And what you've talked about in the past is that it's because people have, how can we even trust Zen? I mean, it's such a distortion of this original concept, but ultimately we're talking about people who deeply experience the material. And because we've talked about this before, we're diving into an area that's pre-linguistic. You can come out with any kind of poetry in terms of how it can communicate easily with people. There's any number of dynamics. So you've talked about that pretty extensively.
Yes.
Exactly. Okay. Excellent. So, and there was a particular thing that we were talking about recently that I thought was really interesting because, for me, my background is in sculpture. I went to school for conceptual art. You know this. And for me, I was always interested when there was, some new innovation would arrive, and then someone else would say, no, it's this other thing, you're wrong. And eventually there would be some other, the synthesis of the two, someone else would come along and say, oh, you're both actually talking about the same thing. And I remember I once asked you in great earnestness, I said, Shinzen, why is there so much strife between the Burmese side of the, equation, the Burmese folks, Theravada folks, and the Thai Theravada folks? And it's like I, feeling these arguments in my life. And you said in this very sort of powerful way, for me it was powerful. You said, at the beginning, you just see that everything is separate. And then through experience, you start to see that all of this is actually just the same thing. And so right now, I experience myself as someone taking in a lot of influences and a lot of really powerful material and doing the work to experience it myself. And so one thing I see right now is a major impact of the Mind Illuminated system, and how this discussion around attention and awareness, how that fits into your system, and how that obviously fits into this course that we're doing now. So I wanted to do a short recap of what we talked about in our last conversation, then we can just riff from there, if that's okay. So the Mind Illuminated system is a meditation system. I won't try to define it in a single sentence, but it's a meditation system. There's a heavy emphasis in that system on these two things, which are called attention and awareness. Attention is roughly defined as the sort of zooming in quality of the mind, using Shinzen's language, the ability to designate an area which we focus on. Usually when we use words like focus, we're talking about this. And awareness is often considered a more overall sense of our sense data, and is sometimes associated with zooming out. In Shinzen's system, it's not that there's a contradiction, but the words are just slightly different. And so you Shinzen talk about zooming in or out as a way of how we direct the mind. We can pinpoint on a single point. We can open up our awareness to attend to more data at the same time. And there's the ability of the mind to sort of zoom in and out. Is that a good rough description?
Yes, and just to fill in a little bit more, where it gets very interesting. See, there's lumpers and there's splitters. And that's fine, because actually, dialectically, we need both processes, I believe.
Yes.
And I can even show you things about the topology of the nervous system that would sort of be coherent with the notion that that's a very basic way of processing.
And what do you mean by lumping and splitting?
So lumping means seeing similarities. Splitting means seeing differences. So there's how much you lump and how much you split, which is something we can talk about. But there's also qualitatively, as opposed to quantitatively, what are you lumping and what are you splitting? Are you lumping together the things that really need to be lumped together, although it may not be obvious to most people that that's the case? And are you splitting the things that are really important to split, even though, once again, it may or may not be obvious to most people that that is the case? So it's like making the right integrations and the right differentiations is a little bit maybe the name of the game of consciousness. That's maybe too much of a claim, but it's important. So the you could say, oh, look, Shinzen talks about zooming in and zooming out, but Chuladasa talks about, what was it again?
Attention and awareness.
Attention and awareness. So which one is right?
Who's the true guru? Who do I dedicate my life and give my finances to?
Well, moi, obviously. But the sort of like, what are you thinking? Response to me is, do you not find it amazing that two people who didn't communicate with each other at all, but were just sort of experimenting freely from tradition for a long period of time, came up with essentially the same notion, although languaged very differently and used in a different context. Oh my God, there must be some universality here, because look at how similar they are. But what people will jump to is, what was it? Attention and awareness. Well, Shinzen says this other thing, these other words, but it's like, that's trivial. The other words and the other context is trivial. Something of significance independently discovered, because this, as far as I know, I don't know how Chuladasa got this, but I'm not particularly aware of this being talked about in the canon. Maybe it is in ways that I've missed, that someone would say, oh no, it's there, just look. But
certainly somewhere.
Yeah, so where, you know, the important thing is to see the intersection. So the Unified Mindfulness system, it is a practice system, that is correct. However, it's also a way to think about all practice systems. And it's designed to be that. So there's two sides. One is intellectual and artistic. And I'd like to get back to art if you're interested in this conversation. But one is intellectual and aesthetic. That's one side. The other side is practical. So the I want to talk about the intellectual and aesthetic first.
Right.
So it's a way of thinking about all practice systems. So you can look at any particular practice system and say, okay, with respect to this dimension, this subdimension, this sub-subdimension of what we call practice, how does this system talk about that? How do they work with it? Maybe they don't talk about it, or maybe they've made important innovations. And then with respect to this other subdimension of this other dimension of this other fundamental side of practice, how does system A do it? And then we can do the same for system B, and then we can compare. The purpose is to make the right lumpings and the right splittings so that it looks beautiful. Sorry, but that was the first criterion. I'm following the lead of another scientist, much more. It's like saying, I'm following the lead of Muhammad Ali. Einstein, he'd go with what was beautiful first, and then figure out the physicality of it. So I wanted to create a way of organizing contemplative practice that had two sides to it. It was beautiful in its symmetry and relative simplicity, but also would actually be a valid theory in the sense of science, where you're carefully defining things and reasoning, if possible, from first principles. So I wanted it to have those characteristics of being a good pre-scientific theory, and also being beautiful. That's on one side.
Elegant and effective.
Yes, that's a nice way to put it. On the elegant side, the side that says it's beautiful and also intellectually sound. So I'm going to write that down. That's nice. Well, what was the word? Elegant?
And effective.
So on the effective side, two things. This means the practical side. A practical side designed to be used conveniently to develop a true science of enlightenment. So it's designed for the convenience of scientific research based on what I know about the convenience of scientific research. That's one side to the practical. And now the final one, the one that people who are listening may find relevant, if nothing else, the main idea behind unified mindfulness is that once you have looked at it with or without having practiced it, but if you've thought about it and perhaps even also practiced a little bit, you should now be set to make optimal use of any legitimate practice system implemented by any competent teacher. We want to set you up to outsource the enlightenment of the world to the competent teachers of the world. So you can see this one is doing this, and this one is doing this, and they're related in this way, a certain way. And so you'll understand the complementarity and also the useful contrasts and supplementarities of all of the different practice systems, East, West, ancient, or modern. So the reason we call it unified is not because we're claiming this is, we've got the universal system to end all systems. It's rather, this is just one system like any other system, but it's been designed so that if you get into it a little bit, you'll be able to use all systems. And so it's the system to open the door to all the systems so that all the systems integrate naturally because we have clarified what the dimensions are. And then we have clarified the relationships between the locations in those dimensions. And so with that, you don't have something that's a claim to being a final map. You have something that will be a map of maps moving forward and hopefully be improved. And at some point, when we have an actual science of enlightenment, by that time, the unified system will have evolved into something compatible with that.
That's great. And another layer here, I think, is that it's not just a map of maps. There's another sort of, this sort of one layer more personal, is that it gives people the ability to navigate not just a bunch of meditation systems, which is well and good, but to navigate every sensory experience that they could possibly come across, every interaction that they, happen in the world. And again, this isn't to say one system is better than another. This is just a little bit of a zoom out on your system and worldview. is that some systems, the way they function, which is perfectly valid, is in a sense you charge up through doing meditation. You charge the battery, and maybe you observe one thing and you really charge up in the morning, and then throughout the day you drain that battery, maybe you recharge a little at night. The one potential challenge is that you can drain the battery all the way down because you're maybe in a global pandemic, I don't know. And what do you do then? Well, I don't have time to sit down. I don't have time to, I'm running right now, or I'm arguing or whatever, and watching my breath, or one particular object doesn't work very well. So your system unfolds every sense experience that is available and makes that a doorway to, you know, awakening or fulfillment or connection with another person. So each teacher then, which is what I've seen, each teacher can take whatever's important to them in their life and their view of reality and say, oh, I'm going to arrange these pieces in a way that'll most directly help people move down this particular alley or this thing, whatever people are asking for. And in this case, my emphasis is on how to use those pieces to help guide people first through this material of the Mahasi's Progress of Insight, but more so even is how to use that material and that scope to assess and move towards having a more fulfilling life in general. Because I don't care if people have a cool psychedelic experience, that's lovely. I care more if people feel fulfilled and feel like their lives are more meaningful than they were yesterday.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Excellent. Okay. So I wanted to share something. I have no idea how this will work because I'm usually in reception mode when when we're chatting, which is my favorite thing. I wanted to share something here, which is some slides that I usually use in the class itself. And I thought we would just talk about those as like something to, like a conversation compass, if that works for you.
Yeah.
Okay. So in that case, I'm going to open a shared screen. These are some of the slides. Okay. So the premise is attention, you know, we call it focus, zoomed in. It's high, and these are using some of the TMI sort of Mind Illuminated definitions, but also a lot of what you talk about. Zoomed in, it's like high resolution. It's a contained area. It's often somewhat small, exclusive, detailed, clear in size and location. And sometimes it can be very effortful to hold the mind in this small area, excluding everything else in particular. And it is a kind of splitting. When you started talking about splitting and lumping, I thought we were going in this direction, so it's good that we're circling back. But that it tends to split. It's the part of the mind that divides things and says, okay, here's a thing and there's another thing, and these two things are different.
So before we move on,
please
would it be fair to say that this is your interpretation of some of the stuff that Chuladasa and I talk about?
Yes. In a sense, it's my attempt to move, hopefully smoothly through both of them. And as we move forward, it moves more towards sort of things that are core towards your system. But these are some of the sort of starting.
Because this is a very diligent presentation.
Well, thanks. And it's worth noting that part of the luxury that I have, not being the sort of standard bearer and defining figure of a meditation system, which attempts to be scientifically, relevant and accurate, is I can just round all the corners I want. I can say this means this and that means that, and that's my rules now. So there are some places where I'm not trying to be canonical, and I'm not trying to necessarily agree with.
But see, the filter that you're providing is actually very interesting because
there you go. I'm doing a little bit of my job. Okay, so next we have here awareness, which is often referred to as open awareness, sometimes referred to as zooming out, although if we get into it, awareness can really be anywhere. Lower definition, but of a larger area. It's more inclusive, general, soft edges, often restful, to stay with. And the way that it organizes data is it clumps and it tends to ignore or erase edges. So in a way, I'm not just saying it is like this, I'm sort of defining this set of perceiving, qualities and saying, okay, we're going to call this awareness at the same time. Okay. So there's that. And now this is for me where it gets interesting. This is all, okay, this all makes sense. We're already here. That's what I wanted to to do is, so basically Dhamma and Rupa, it'll get into it actually in the next slide anyway, but I'll just say
Oh,
now
okay.
that, actually I wanted to ask you, because I think you've told me before, who is the teacher, who is the monk who had spent X number of years never lying down, living in a cave? I remember you telling me that you received some communique that this teacher was coming, not only coming to town or coming to your, Sangha. This is in the 80s or 70s?
80s,
80s.
probably.
Coming to town, but he was coming to town tomorrow, and he would like, or they would like if there was if he could teach he would like to teach to someone. So just if you wouldn't mind setting that up. And so you had to very quickly organize a whole bunch of people, and you wanted to be respectful, so you wanted a lot of people to be there in the course of like a few hours. And people would ask him all these questions, and then I'll let you take on from there. So go ahead.
Something like that.
Something like that. Sorry, this is my, again, rounded corner version.
It's close enough. I remember them saying he hasn't gone horizontal for decades. Taungpulu Sayadaw.
Say it one more time.
Taung, Taung, Pulu, Pulu. And then Sayadaw means an honorific for a teacher.
Yeah.
It's actually, Saya is Asaya, Acharya. Da means great. So it's just a title that they give people, like Mahasi Sayadaw. Yeah. So it was the Taungpulu Sayadaw, the master from Taungpulu. And yes, this was very interesting. So, in Spanish, they say, cada loco con su tema. It means every crazy has their pet theme. But the flip of that is claridad. Yeah, yeah. Cada maestro con su claridad. Each master has their own clarity. So with Sasaki Roshi, it's expansion contraction. As far as liberation goes, I like that. Of course, there's more to this path than liberation, but expansion contraction's pretty good for how deep consciousness tastes. I think we may be able to prove it in the lab. We'll see. It's like each master that has a new insight, that's a new contribution to the field. But it can also be a little annoying because they just go over the same thing over and over again because there's just nowhere else to go. They've converged. So that's why you find in Leonard Cohen's song, Love Itself, I think. He says, I'll try to say a little more in the refrain. And then he just says the same goddamn thing again. I'll try to say a little more. And then he just says the same thing again. He was parodying our teacher, Sasaki Roshi.
Yeah.
Anyway, so when I get one of these really senior masters that's harping away at something I don't understand, to me, that's like, wow, this is cool. Someday, hopefully, I'll understand this because clearly there's something here. So the Taungpulu Sayadaw would just over and over again say there's nothing but Nam Yop. What the hell's Nam Yop? That's the Burmese pronunciation of Nama Rupa. So Rupa becomes Yupa, becomes Yopa, becomes Yopa. And Nama becomes Nam. So there's nothing but Nam Yop. So
and students would say, so like, what do I do about stress in my with my boyfriend? And he would say, there is nothing but I always do the Goenka voice.
Just,
there is nothing but Nama and Rupa. But yeah, that was the answer to basically everything.
There is nothing but Nama and Rupa. Right. Nama Rupa Eva. bhavati. Okay, so what the hell is nama and what the hell is rupa? Well, they're words in Pali and they also have meaning in Sanskrit. They appear a lot in the Pali canon. Nama, if it sounds like the English word name, believe it or not, that is not a coincidence. It means name originally. Now, as an ontological category or a philosophical concept or a contemplative techno vocabulary, well, it probably doesn't mean name, probably means something else. But nama is something. Rupa is closest I could get is form, but matter also maybe primarily rupa.
And didn't I understand the exact translation is body?
Sometimes rupa means body, but I think matter is more the primary sense. Vaguely remember that the Tibetan word for body was rupa, but maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I mentioned that just because some people, I mean, there's just so many definitions, and some people will say it's the way of describing body and mind.
Oh, okay.
That's
well,
part of the premise, but that with the implication of that is it's everything that, you know, could be implied by those.
That's right. There are people that have profound contemplative experience, which is great for them, but how can I put this into words? How can I give visual, spatial metaphors? How can I humanly, emotionally stir other human beings with my discoveries? That's a very big challenge.
Right.
If it's new and important, I really want to hear that. That's something I want to know. The problem is there's sort of a good news, bad news. Good news is someone has said something important. Bad news is we may not be getting it quite the way they said it.
Yeah.
Not only is there distortion, but the teacher might not have actually been as precise as they thought they were. And now they're gone. So they had something to say and we can't talk to them about it anymore. So we have to be respectful and imaginative and also resist the tendency to fundamentalism around canonical formulations.
Right. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I think that when I heard you tell that story, for me, I had a similar reaction where I thought, this person saw this as very important. And this was a lens or a sort of facet of the crystal that for them, they could, you know, was a prism for them. They could actually see all of the color of the world sort of coming through this one facet, and it turned into a nice little laser beam that for them was a great guide and they felt was the best guide that they could bring students along. And so this question for me came up of what would be meaningful from my experience in terms of what's described as nama and rupa beyond the ordinary thing.
It's a very interesting question.
Yeah. Is it okay if I talk a little bit about what some of the things that you've said, how I define this now? So, and this is what's really interesting to me is in art school, as a teenager, I became very interested in Zen. From whatever limited way that I could have contact with that through books and this kind of thing, occasional monastic contact. And in college, I became very interested in what's called post-structuralism or deconstructivism as a way of relating to, you know, art theory, this kind of thing. So I won't get into that. There was a lot of the things that I heard said in those fields sounded so much like the Zen that I had, you know, grown accustomed to and really loved, that it became so interesting to me. And a lot of the concepts were around linguistics, and that the formation of language is the primary order, or language is the primary ordering structure of our mind, and that we break the world into these various objects. And these objects are, it just sounded so much like Buddhism to me. These objects are not permanent. They're continuously negotiated between people. The self is one of these objects. There is no stability of any of these objects, and they're continuously being refreshed or redefined. And I'm sitting here going, and they're like, and the way to find, freedom here is just to read about it and think about it. Like, for me, it was very clear that at least my experience was more on the meditation path. So when I came to this idea of Nama and Rupa, what came to mind was this, basically the definition of language. The definition of language being the mind's tendency to put things to package things, to put things into ordered pieces. And there was this huge argument in artwork, in the history of artwork, which was more primary. Was it phenomenology, which minimalists said that phenomenology in the physical body and the experience of space prior to its linguistic sort of overlay was more fundamental, and the conceptual artist said no, it's the mind, the overlay. There's no escaping this mental overlay. And of course, people just fought and said these two things are
fascinating.
And it's really cool, right? And this is what I was doing in art school. I was making conceptual art.
At this point, the conversation has been cut short because of technical difficulties. But Shinzen and I got back together to talk about these topics because, like he said, this is really fascinating. We'll discuss the relationship of the philosophy of art history and how that relates to the philosophy of contemplative practice, and how we can use that to better our lives and deepen our meditation. So join us for part 2 of this conversation with Shinzen Young.